Welcome to this episode of the Greenprint podcast series, where we tackle one of the most pressing challenges of our time, decarbonizing Europe. With the Clean Industrial Act under development and the newly approved Ursula von der Leyen II Commission setting ambitious targets, the stakes have never been higher. Today we'll explore how Europe can navigate its economic challenges, address regulatory hurdles, close the investment gap, innovate for a greener future and bring citizens along this journey. We're joined by three remarkable guests who bring diverse perspectives to the table. Piet de Keyzer, former chief economist at BNP Paribas and partner at Growth Inc., known for his critical take on Europe's sustainability policies and their impact on industry. Piet, a visionary impact investor dedicated to projects that improve the planet and human well-being, and Brecht Seifi, global sustainability lead at SAS, a decarbonization expert who believes in AI-driven solutions like the carbon co-pilot to balance innovation, competitiveness, and financial sustainability. Let's dive in by setting the stage with Europe's current economic situation. Welcome, Peter. Welcome, Piet. Welcome, Brecht. Peter, Europe is at a crossroad, facing slow economic growth, high energy costs, some industrial concerns. Can you give us an overview of the economic challenges that we are dealing with today?
Well, thank you for having me here. I think if you look at if you want to have a good overview of, let's say, the economic challenges for Europe, there's no better place to start than the report Mario Draghi delivered last year, which deals with Europe's competitiveness. There's a number of very striking analyses in that report, and what Europe actually deals with is first, a lack of an integrated and European single market. We always talk about the single market, but there isn't really a single market. There's still a lot of hurdles to export between different countries that holds us back. Then secondly, there's a lot of regulation and red tape. One example that Mario Draghi gave, for example, the GDPR regulation that everybody knows because you have to click away multiple cookies every day. It costs an average SME 15% of their profit on an annual basis. That is the cost of regulation. And finally, high energy prices. There's a number of reasons for that. We don't have our own fossil fuels. We aim for decarbonization and weaning ourselves off fossil fuels. We want to go for green alternatives. Now, the combination of all obviously makes sure that we become a less attractive place to invest. And you see that these energy prices are right now a very crucial factor. So on the one hand, we want to go for decarbonization, which means we start paying for the CO2 we emit. And that's a good thing because CO2 is an externality. It's something that is bad for the climate. It's bad for the planet as a whole. And if we apply that on a global basis, that will be excellent news. But if we're the only ones paying for our CO2 and the rest of the world doesn't, then our good intentions basically come at a price. And the price is deindustrialization, and the price is lower economic growth and lower productivity growth. And that is ongoing right now. And we do need the economic growth because we all like the social benefits we have. We all like the welfare model we have, the unique model that Europe has, but we need economic growth and added value to pay for that model.
Piet, do you look at it at the same level or from the same point of view?
We need growth, but growth can be qualitative growth and not only quantitative growth. So I think there is no alternative in going towards less energy consumption and towards more renewable energy production. So for me, it's clear that if you take into account the world as a whole and all externalities, it's also the cheapest way to energize the world. Wind and solar are there enough, and so this transformation towards this low energy economy, there is no way back. We will do it, and I think we as Europe, a stronger Europe, a stronger, even a stronger Commission can set rules. And although the competitiveness is an issue, I think we can also use it as an advantage, and being in the forefront of not too much regulation, but good regulation is needed.
Brecht, you're also linked to competitiveness, sustainability. How do you see this from a European context?
I think, as Peter is saying, the Draghi report was a game-changing report that set the tone for the next 5 years in Europe. So I think this was the basis also for the Clean Industrial Act that came into fruition this week. What Draghi mentioned in his report was we need to cut all the red tape because there are a lot of compliancy obligations for companies. Some of them too complex, way too difficult to achieve. So let's focus and go back to the basics. I have one example on decarbonization, which is the ETS market. So we have in Europe an ETS market since 2005, where we say we want to price the pollution of 1 ton of CO2. We want to put a price tag on that. So back in 2005, all companies were saying, hey, if we would do that, then we will become less competitive on the international market. So what the Commission decided, they said, okay, we understand you, we hear you, and we will give every country some free allowances. Those free allowances, free EUAs, will give every member state the right to give some allowances to their most polluting industries. So now we are 20 years later, and we see that we have it's a cap and trading system. So we have the Green Deal. We want to become climate neutral in 2050, meaning that cap of CO2 emissions in total will decrease over time. But of course, we have those free allowances. So the Commission said we need to decrease those free allowances because otherwise it doesn't make any sense and we will run out of allowances in the end. So that's why the carbon border adjustment mechanism, it's a kind of climate taxation, climate measure that the European Commission put forward, where they say, okay, we are strict for our own companies here in Europe. Our own companies need to buy allowances to pollute. So they internalize the negative externalities that Peter mentioned. And of course, it's a market. So prices are fluctuating every day. But the consequence, I would say, is now that we will decrease these free allowances that we gave to our own companies here, again, we are back at 2005 because now the companies are saying again, how will we survive on the international market, but also locally? Because I have a company, a cement company. They per ton of cement, you have 1 ton of CO2. And I think for aluminum, it's per ton of aluminum, you have 6.5 ton of CO2 emissions. It's huge. What is for me the next step? Well, I will leave Europe and I will re-export back to Europe. So in order to level the playing field, they said, well, okay, we are strict for our own companies. Let's also be just and strict for exporting companies towards Europe to avoid carbon leakage, they call it. So I think that's a mechanism that works. It's a market-based mechanism. But again, if we tie that to what Draghi said, we saw that 200,000 companies were affected by that. But actually, 20% of those companies were responsible for 95% of the emissions. Meaning that for all the other companies, sometimes it's 5,000 K that they should pay, but there is a huge administrative burden. And for me, the nice thing of the Draghi report is that they said, okay, let's really focus on those industries that pollute a lot of CO2 emissions where we could have an impact. And all the other ones, let's avoid that extra administrative burden and let's help them to decarbonize, but not punish them. And for me, that's a good symbol, a good reflection of what a smart, clean industrial policy in Europe should be like. Think before you regulate, because once regulations come into fruition, it's very difficult to change them or to remove them. So I'm really keen on these kind of market-based mechanisms that are helping our continent to decarbonize, but also helping us to stay competitive, because that was the core message of Draghi: competitiveness, at the same time economic security and decarbonization. I think it's that triangle that for me is one of the core messages of that report.
Peter, are we over-regulated?
I think we are overregulated, absolutely. Yeah. Do you think we're overregulated? We make regulation even before a new industry comes to fruition. Look at the AI Act, for example. We're the first continent to come up with an AI Act, but we don't have any sizable AI companies to begin with. And again, I don't think that these politicians or regulators are of ill will or they mean ill, but we try to limit all the risks before a business even starts. And by doing that with the best intentions, you limit a lot of businesses from starting in the first place. That's the first one. I mean, when I come back to the ETS that you mentioned, indeed, every economist knows that you have to internalize externalities. When there's externalities, there's the tragedy of the commons, it's called. You have to make sure that people pay for their external costs. But when you're the only one paying for your external costs and the rest doesn't, there isn't a level playing field. And if Europe is the only one imposing ETS, and indirectly imposing ETS by applying the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the consequence for European consumers is that they will pay more money for the goods that they're buying than people in other continents. That will be the consequence. They will buy green steel, and they will buy cars which have been punished because they aren't green, or steel which isn't green. But the consumers here will actually pay a higher price, and will see lower standards of living. They will contribute to a better climate by doing that, but they will pay a higher price. Now, obviously, if they pay a higher price and they see that the rest of the world isn't, there's only so far that principles and let's say care for the climate or the environment will take you. If people have been promised, let's say, a land of plenty because of reduction of CO2, because of decarbonization, because of green energy, etc., and after a while they only get higher prices and maybe less qualitative products, then that will lead to people voting for populist parties. That will lead people, you will lose people at the end of the day. That's what the governor of the central bank in Belgium told last week when he presented his annual report. If you promise people that green technologies will only yield us extra prosperity, and in the end it yields us higher prices, people will accuse you of spreading fake news. And I think that is something we have to take care of. And we have to take that in consideration. The way the world is changing, the world isn't the place anymore where we all make governance of how to govern worldwide problems. If we're the last ones realizing that, we will lose out. So we have to be pragmatic. I think we have to cut CO2 emissions. We have to. If only for the fact that we don't have our own fossil fuels. So every cubic meter of gas you do not burn is money you're not paying to Algeria, Qatar, or to Russia. So it's in our own interest to do that. But I don't think that you can pre-impose targets to actually lower these to let's say zero in a couple of decades' time. That will cost us a lot of industry and a lot of prosperity. And the final thing I want to remark is, in the 1970s and 80s, we didn't have any climate policy. Yet a lot of European countries actually cut their CO2 emissions. If you look at CO2 per head of the population, it actually fell quite dramatically. In a country like France, for example, it fell spectacularly. Why? Because after the oil shock of the 1970s, a lot of countries decided to double down on nuclear energy, which is how they saw their CO2 footprint fall. So even in the absence of climate policy, we actually cut our CO2 emissions. So consuming less fossil fuels is in our own best interest because the price is too high, because we don't have our own fossil fuels. But pre-imposing targets where you have to go, I fear that we're going too fast, and I fear that we will lose prosperity.
I think what Peter is saying is right. That there is also a consumer thing that needs to happen. Consumers also need to be aware of the CO2 emissions that they are, the goods that they are buying, that there is a price tag for the environment, right? Also, the energy that they are consuming, it's definitely one of the things to take into account. But what's concerning carbon markets, what I'm really keen on, and that's an evolution that we see in the past few years. China has created an ETS market. Turkey last week created an ETS market. Taiwan created a CBAM. UK will start in 2027 to create a CBAM. So what Peter is saying is absolutely right. Decarbonization cannot be tackled in Europe only. It's a global initiative. It needs to be tackled on a global level.
And one thing I want to mention as well is that we look at CBAM and the big polluters, etc. I mean, people hardly have any literacy of where CO2 actually comes from. People hardly know what the CO2 footprint of their behavior is. And I think making people more literate when it comes to CO2 is a very important one. One example I often cite is an average Belgian eats 80 kilograms of meat per year. Now, you need 60 kilograms of CO2 to produce 1 kilogram of meat. So on average, 3 tons just for your meat consumption. Now, if you want to have 3 tons of CO2 emissions, and let's say I'm a vegetarian and I say I'm entitled to pollute, to emit 3 tons of CO2, you can drive 13,000 kilometers with the Porsche 911 during an entire year. But right now, somebody who's vegetarian and rides a Porsche is regarded badly, whereas somebody who rides a bike and eats a lot of meat isn't. So people have no clue where this CO2 comes from. And the ETS is nice for industry, but you have to make people aware of where the CO2 of their own behavior patterns comes from. And ultimately, you would need a price on all CO2 so that people can actually change their behavior. It's okay, I change from, let's say, meat to fish or to poultry or to other kinds, because people need to know where the CO2 comes. Right now, something above their heads. It's something for factories, it's something for Europe. They only see prices going up, but make people aware and show them that it's in our own best interest to do these things.
Piet, is that one of the most important things to do, to not only convince, but educate people?
Yes, but it's educating is not enough. It's not only by rational insights that, okay, I will have to change my habitudes that it will happen. So for me, the trigger is really that the most sustainable products are in fact the most cheap or the cheapest ones. And by integrating all externalities, all carbon emissions, I think it's the way to go. And I'm not a specialist in regulation, but what I see is, okay, starting from we have a climate crisis, we should try to reduce carbon emissions. And you see those many nice initiatives in plant-based substitutes for meat. And when it becomes tastier, when it becomes more normal to, there was a nice publicity on hamburgers where do you want a normal or do you want someone with meat? So for me, the idea of making the best from a sustainability standpoint, the best alternative, also the most normal, that's what we need, that everyone will choose the ones who are best for the planet also. And I guess this education, of course, but a strong government, a strong legislation can help really, not a bigger government or a bigger state, but a state that thinks long-term in the common sense with clear rules, and then the market will find solutions. And that's what I see happening every day. I see many of those initiatives from social enterprises, but also listed companies going in this direction with or without those regulations. So that's my hope, that it will finally go in this direction.
Maybe one thing just to chime in on also what Peter said. So pricing signals in the economy are important. So imagine that I am now, let's say, a Belgian steel manufacturer, and I need to buy my iron ore. And I have two options. I have the Chinese company, and I have let's say, an example out of the Nordics. Two prices. Of course, the price out of the Nordics will be way more expensive. Chinese one will be made more cheap. But now when I have that carbon mechanism, which steps into play on an import level, maybe the Chinese exporter is now way more expensive. So I have maybe there is a pricing signal that says, okay, let's not only look at price and how that iron ore has been mined. Let's also look at the carbon dimension. Now I'm redirected towards those companies that are having more, or taking sustainability more into account. So that new dimension of looking at it and taking carbon as a factor in your total strategy, I think that's how CFOs more and more will look at it in companies, because otherwise it has a price tag. What is also important with ETS markets, if you, for example, the company in China has polluted 10 tons of CO2, they will pay in their country of origin, and they can deduct that from what they would need to pay in Europe. So that's also the reason why you see all this ETS marking rising. It's not always that they say, hey, we are a fan of ETS markets or putting a price on carbon. It's also like Europe exports its regulation to other countries. And I think if we are front runner and if we are low in our carbonization from our energy intensive industries, we could have an edge there. And I see this as a viable instrument where Europe could take the lead. Of course, we need to have the industry capacity here and the investment done here in Europe to produce these energy neutral or CO2 neutral goods. But I think that's really the future. But I fully agree with you in agriculture, because last time in our first podcast, Mr. Van den Bergen was here. He mentioned that on agriculture level, they're also thinking to create an ETS mechanism to also put a price tag on what's on maybe practices in agriculture that are not so sustainable. So it's a movement. I think in Europe we are taking the lead. There are some trade-offs, fully agree, but I think it's the right mechanism. It's better that you do it market-based than say, no, you need to comply, and then everything will do a check in the box at the end of the year and we're fine. So that's, I think, a mechanism that could...
It's also the question what you want, obviously. Yeah? So maybe one thing on the CBAM, what you already notice is that, for example, countries which are affected by CBAM, so which export steel or aluminum, which is deemed too polluting for Europe, that actually these countries are applying trade restrictions on European goods as, let's say, a revenge mechanism. So you could imagine that you're exporting your regulation, but you could also face retaliatory measures. So that's quite important to take into account. And we also have to know what we want. For example, if you look at the cheapest European electric vehicle that you could buy, which is still a Volkswagen, I think Renault is going with a very cheap one, is still much more expensive than, let's say, a Chinese vehicle. You have BYD vehicles for less than 10,000 euros, and you could decarbonize our entire fleet by allowing these cars massively on the European market. So if we're really serious about climate, we should allow that. But what did the European car makers say? No, that's too much competition for us. Please slap some tariffs on these guys. And then we said, well, they get a lot of state support, so we're not going to do that. And so we slap tariffs on them. So we deliberately make the decarbonization solution for consumers more expensive to force them to buy European. And that's what I fear will ultimately happen, especially in a world that is fracturing, in which you have a US president who withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, that you will end up with a world with a lot of subsidies, a lot of trade restrictions, in which basically, ultimately, the consumer will pay more, and we will not be closer to any climate solution.
Piet, I want to make a little comparison. If we're looking to investors in general, don't they have the same feeling as, okay, we don't want to take the risk, so we don't invest in decarbonization because of the fact that the percentage of the return is maybe too low, or the risk is too high? Why in the end we will end with we need more subsidies?
But totally, in that sense, we say if we want to finance the change we need to change finance. And in fact, finance in general is too risk averse, and we can understand it as long as you take only two dimensions into account. It's risk return. There is a clear relationship between those. The more return you want, the more risk you have to take. If you add this third dimension, which is positive societal impact, then things become different. We find investors who are ready to make higher risk or take higher risk, even without asking for 15% return, if the impact is fantastic high. So if the third dimension comes in, this equation becomes different, and this is the way we have to look how to move more capital towards positive societal impact. And societal means people and planet. So also this, and we see some good examples where, for example, in the pension funds, we see they have billions. They say they want all to do more in sustainable, but we don't find the right projects. They say, or right projects, meaning, we have to maximize. That's their fiduciary duty. Maximize. It's not our money, they say. So we have to maximize the returns. In fact, in France, they introduced this 90-10 rule, where every employee can ask his or her pension fund that at least invest 10% in social economy. So by just putting this question or ask with the employee, it turned into 5 billion euros more in social economy. So this rule, changing the rule that pension funds hiding behind their fiduciary duty, you can solve it because people want it. If you can invest in social housing and have a return of 3-4%, people prefer this to do. Some people, not all people, but there are enough citizens who really say, okay, if I can do it, okay, it has to be very professional, it has to be well managed, but you can find those solutions. Also, investing in wind energy today, it's doable to have, even with citizen corporations, 4 or 5%. It's possible to have these nice returns. It's better than on your saving account, and it's in fact the way to go. But how can you mobilize much more capital into this sector? Sometimes it's by changing the rules or changing mentality, by showing that it is possible.
Is it about changing the mindset, Peter, or is it too easy?
No, I think that people have preferences, right? I mean, you can change people's preferences. You can educate them. You can talk about it. So people's preferences might actually change. And if people see that there's an actual return to whatever they invest, because most people are still return driven. They're still return driven. So I think that's an important factor that needs to be taken into account. I do want to warn that there's, for example, in the US, there was a recent case. I think it was a BlackRock that was sued by a union of quite a big sector, which said, by investing in a certain amount of sectors which are sustainable, etc., you have actually foregone a certain return, and I sue you for the fact that you didn't maximize my return. So those are the two opposites, obviously. So people look at social return, that's very important, and you have to show what the return could be. But people are interested in financial return as well. You don't pay if you retire and you have your pension fund. You cannot live off your social return. It's a harmonious society, which you want, obviously, but financial return is also important. I think educating people on the interplay between both, that's very important, and telling people about that. But I do want to stress that there's a number of initiatives you can take in which regulation plays a role. We talked about should you pay a CO2 tax on your meat, for example. A lot of alternatives, for example, in the of meat replacing technologies or foods, etc., are right now too expensive. Maybe because real meat is artificially cheap, because we don't price in the CO2. And maybe if we price in the CO2 into that meat, we'll make real meat more expensive because you internalize the external cost. And then all of a sudden, there's a number of startups which might be able to compete with the real thing. So right now, they have to compete in an uneven market. So for our steel companies, we say, okay, we want you to pay for the CO2 that you emit, and we'll protect you against unfair competition from someplace else with CBAM. We don't do the same with these entrepreneurs who try to come up with sustainable food alternatives. So they would be helped if in our food production, the externalities were priced to a much bigger extent, and that sector would boom if the real price and the real cost of, let's say, our food would be internalized.
Yeah, I fully agree, because companies now have the option. the ETS allowances are set to rise because the free allowances will go as of 26, 27 out of the market with a percentage of 10%. So the supply will decrease, so the price will increase. Now, there is always a tipping point for a company where I say, well, we're happy to pay it versus now maybe we should start looking at alternatives because it starts to become quite expensive. There was a case that I recently saw from Dan Maleski, he's an expert, CBAM at Retro Advisors, where he flagged out an average Turkish cement company that is exporting to Europe. They did the analysis, the projection of 10 years, what they should pay on CBAM only is 750 million euros over a period of 10 years. That's huge. So when this is discussed in the boardroom, well, people start getting interested and like, oh, what the heck? What is happening? So are there alternatives where we can avoid polluting that much? And there comes innovation into play, investment. And I agree with you. Investment in the end is always risky. I think in Europe, we are quite risk averse, especially in clean tech. And I'm really happy to see that with the Clean Industrial Act, 100 billion is being allocated to have more guarantees for companies that are willing to make that investment to kind of hedge that risk. And otherwise, we in Europe versus the States, we don't have that single market. We have a lot of fragmented markets where capital allocation is different. We are risk averse. Versus if you are a company and you purely, for example, Northvolt was a very good example. They were severely backed by venture capital. But venture capital, they always bet on the upside. But I think a healthy financing mix is not only VC, but it's also lending money, trying to have money from banks. But of course, they hedge against the downside. So it's quite important to find that balance for companies to, okay, in the long term, the venture capitalists, they would like to see the visionary future of a company. And I think Northvolt was a perfect example of the gigawatts or the terawatts that they wanted to produce in their companies in a sustainable way. But of course, in the short term, it's hugely capital intensive. There is a lot of cash burn. And if you don't manage to also look at the short term to get everything up and running, the manufacturing, the equipment, it's all capital intensive. Those cash flow conversions, cash conversion cycles are super long. It's not like a software as a service company where I need a roof, I need electricity, I need someone who can code. And then you have a kind of a predictable revenue model. It's not the same. So therefore, to break that trajectory, we need somehow to have a government, Europe, who steps in and to try to help us with becoming less risky of an investment.
I think one important difference also is in how Europe could relatively easily change, let's say, the equation or the calculus for a company instead of relying on subsidies, relying on tax credits. Right now, if I give a 10 million euro subsidy to a company and goes bankrupt after 2 years, the money is gone. If you give a 10 million euro tax credit, it means on the first 10 million of profit taxes you should pay, you don't have to pay them. So you only get the money once you're profitable. That's a much better incentive to actually start something which works, and then you get the money as, let's say, a deduction on the first 10 million that you make. And in the US, you see that subsidies are given, but tax credits are the most used form. And there's a lot of startups and a lot of new industries that start, and these tax credits give you a lot of oxygen and give better incentives than just the subsidies.
You feel the same, Peter?
I was wondering, many startups, of course, need the money also, and so subsidies can help in this first phase. Sometimes subsidies are not the best form, I can agree, but we see more and more kind of outcome related or conditions where you say that some investments are beneficiary for the society as a whole, and so there is other ways of saying that, okay, you can have this subsidy and it's in fact benefiting the society. So it's in fact a positive investment case for the society as a whole, on condition, of course, that the positive impact is realized. And so for me, subsidies can, or an alternative could be more in the kind of guarantees and saying, okay, the first loss capital. So putting money and if all works well and there is a profitable business in the end, it doesn't cost any penny for those for the governments. If it didn't work, it was kind of subsidy or philanthropic money, but that's a way to reduce the risk for the investors, and that's one of the things that we really need in Belgium, in Europe, and investors who combine also hybrid financing. So I agree that it's a combination. It's not only venture capital. It's not only private equity. It can be a bit of subsidies. Maybe even foundation can put money, or social impact first investors who take higher risk or accept lower returns. Sometimes it's needed in the beginning to showcase that it can work. And if it works and you have some profitable business and it's very scalable, you will find the money. That's no problem.
I think maybe something I want to mention related to that as well is that we need much more risk-taking attitude in Europe. So the fact we're talking about subsidies and the government should do this and should do that, I do not believe that the government is the only one who wants the best for society. I do think that there's an enormous amount of investors and private capital that do want the best for society as well. I think that these tax credits give a somewhat better incentive, but that private investors should maybe put up the capital, and then the government says, you know what, I'll provide you tax credits for the first 10 million or 20 million that if you make profit. That structures the incentives a bit better, I would say. And I think we're very risk averse. And because the private sector is very risk averse, we always look to the government to fund scale-ups or businesses that isn't the role of the government. I do think there's a lot of goodwill on investors. I mean, Piet is a very good example. I mean, people who actually look for social impact, and there's a number of other funds and initiatives as well. But we have to be much less risk averse as a society. Of course, we've built society the way it is. But recently there was Jeff Bezos of Amazon, who was trying to explain the difference in growth in versus the US versus Europe. And he says, in the US, you can raise $50 million, and he gave it as an example, $50 million in seed money for a business which has only a 10% chance of working out. Try looking in Europe for 50 million euros for something which only has 10% chance of working. You won't find it in the private sector, and so the government has to step in, and people say, why are you taking that much risk with our taxpayers' money? And I think on behalf of the private investors, we need much more a risk-seeking attitude, and that will drive also a much more dynamic capital market, much more creation of new businesses. We need that much more. And I think then we can achieve a lot of the objectives that we're actually talking about, because I don't think that investors are simply in it for the money. A lot of them do want to have an impact as well. And structuring it in that way, being much more risk-loving, having these tax credits, that could maybe be a combination to achieve a lot of these things.
Yeah, I think currently to start in clean tech, you need to be someone who has where the good of society is quite important because it's really risky. But I agree also with what Peter is saying. In the States, it's way easier, and the mentality is completely different. Because I don't think here in Europe we are lacking startups. We have a lot of startups. We lack scale-ups. Because once see, okay, we need to scale, we need to invest even more, we need to double down on manufacturing, on new plants, then we start seeing problems to get more money. And then they go to the States, to other countries where it is easier to tank that money. So that's a problem. And that's really something where Europe needs to take care on, that environment, that DNA, that entrepreneurial DNA needs to come here, where that risky behavior in the positive sense, is being supported. Because currently, I think we are at the tipping point in Europe. If we don't succeed in combining, becoming more competitive, having that economic security, but also decarbonize, probably it will never happen. It's really the Antwerp Declaration happened time ago, where all these companies came together with a clear signal for the European Commission that, okay, hey, we agree that we need to decarbonize, but we also need to make a profit, and how to reconcile the two. And the Clean Industrial Act now is really a good step in the right direction. But still, the innovative ideas that Peter is explaining with the tax credit, I think it's a good idea. And these instruments, these solutions need to put forward to help and keep these. We don't have a lot of unicorns actually in Europe also. They go away. How can we create more unicorns? How can we create or use our single market? Because in the end, that's one of our strongest assets. We are a big consuming continent. How can we leverage that power and harness also and keep those companies here within Europe? And that's, I think, vital for our future. That's what the Draghi report is saying. That is also the reflection of the Clean Industrial Deal. So that will be the puzzle that we need to put together.
Yeah, and also make it into a true European market and a single market. As said, right now we don't have a real single market. The calculations was made, so it's very difficult if you're a Belgian producer or a startup scale, but try selling goods in another country. All of a sudden, you have new rules that apply, new kinds of wages, kinds of taxes you have to pay, etc., etc. You have to jump through a lot of hoops to actually scale into a European company. It takes a lot of will and money to get there. And the IMF did a calculus on what is this cost of doing business in another country. Now, we're talking about the 25% tariffs that Donald Trump is going to impose on European products. Well, if you look at the average implicit tariff that we impose on ourselves is 45% on goods and 110% on services. Now, if we could get that to go down, that would be a huge boost to growth as well. And if we then try to do these things, that's how you become a much more dynamic economy. I do believe in one European capital market, a real single market, less rules, more entrepreneurship. That is where growth will come from. And you first need to bake the pie before you can start dividing it. And that's something that is very crucial for us to achieve the prosperity.
Peter, do you think that doing that things is of more importance than the Draghi report mentioning we will invest 800 billion euros in a green transition? Is breaking down the burdens between the countries? I
think from that will come a lot of initiatives. If you really want to scale these initiatives and have them on a European scale, you need less borders. I mean, it's like you can build a new port. You can build a new port, but let's say if there's strikes every 3 days, the port won't be very effective. You need both. You need to have a big market. We are the biggest market, right? I mean, for more than 500 million citizens, that's much more than the US. We have a lot of spending power. We have rich consumers. We have smart people. We have a lot of good ideas to actually create big companies. But if you look, for example, over the past 50 years, if you look at companies that were founded less than 50 years ago are right now quoted on the stock market and are worth more than 10 billion euros in valuation. Well, there's a huge amount of those in the US, a lot of them in tech, whereas in Europe, you can count them on two hands. And that's the best illustration of these barriers that we have. A lot of these giants in the US are tech companies. There's the Metas, there's the Alphabets, there's the Nvidias, etc. And why is that so frustrating? Because for tech, you don't need a long family tree or history. You don't need a lot of land. You don't even need a lot of capital. You need a good idea. You need smart people, and you need to be able to scale fast to a bigger scale. Now, we have good ideas. We have smart people, but we haven't been able to scale. And so the fact that the US built all these tech companies, that's so frustrating. If it would have been gold mines, okay, we don't have any gold mines. If it would have been aluminum, we don't have that. But in tech is something which only has something to do with the ideas that we produce and the market we're able to sell them. And that is something that is frustrating. And that is why we have to cut down these borders. And in tech, we probably won't catch up anymore. But let's make sure that in the next wave of whatever technology it is, we're able to do that. And for that, we have to cut down these borders. If you have this 800 billion, you divide it between every country, you will still have substandard or subscale companies. So I think it's very important to cut down these barriers first. If walls are erected around Europe because of tariffs, we have to cut down the walls within Europe.
You feel the same about that, Piet?
But the point on that we need more bigger companies, more ambitious companies, and agreeing that especially in Belgium, what we see, there is money for those smart startups, but really small smart startups, easy to find 500,000, 1 million. But there is a gap between bringing them to scale-ups looking for international expansion. And probably that's one of the reasons that we at a certain moment build an accelerator in impact organizations. But acceleration is not only accelerate growth, but in fact, accelerate also failure, in that sense that you don't have to go on and try it again with much more subsidies or foundation money. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and try another good idea. And so I think we need more ambitious impact organizations, but I see them coming. But it's true that we don't have those good examples in who is the Belgian unicorn market leader in an impact organization? It doesn't exist. I can give the example of chocolate in the Netherlands. There, Tony Chocolonely became the market leader with, in fact, a fair trade idea of it's a nice idea of slavery-free chocolate, and he became the market leader because he was also using the traditional techniques, traditional supermarkets. It didn't stay in the niche of the already convinced. No, it was good chocolate, and it was loved by many people, and it's used at marketing and brand. And so for some of the social organizations, they became too commercial. No, for me, it's this kind of organizations we need, with a good idea, with clearly a better proposal, in this case on slavery-free chocolate, but it can be also in construction, in using wood instead of concrete or cement or steel. Wood is carbon capture inside the building for 50 years, and people are starting with this kind, but today those buildings are more expensive than the other ones. So it's always about integrating all these external costs also, and then it becomes the most interesting.
I want to ask a question about also frustration, and it's from another perspective. Piet, you're also linked to Eoli Corporation. The not in my backyard principle of investing in wind isn't an issue, but placing the mills itself is sometimes more difficult because of regulation, because of people protesting. How frustrating is that? Maybe frustration is it to...
That's one of the biggest hurdles, of course, to have more wind energy is to get the permits. And that's one of the reasons we went offshore, because there were no neighbors and no action committees that are against it. But another way is to involve the neighborhoods and so to create these citizen cooperatives where they can invest also, not only have this not so nice windmill in my backyard, but also can have a nice dividend of 4 or 5% every year. And so what we see is also that the places where there are windmills, where there is wind energy, people in general are much more positive about wind energy than in the places where they are not. So there is a fear about shadow, about noise, but in fact the people who experience it, they are not so they don't suffer. It's for example, the shadow ID, it's only 8 hours maximum every year that the people can suffer from this 8 hours in a year of this shadow effects, which is really, and if you it is possible without subsidies to have a nice wind energy projects, but if you can't have these permits, we will never get there. And so it's also about educating people that they come and visit and hear the noise of these wind energy mills.
Peter, from a communication point of view, do we lack a positive storytelling around this topic?
Well, I think that there's a lot of information going around. I mean, there's if 50 years ago you had to communicate, basically you had three big media groups, all representing a certain political color, with them a union behind that, with behind them some philosophical ideas, and then maybe it was relatively easy to communicate. Everybody remembers, or the people with gray hair probably do, the fact that you put on the television and then the government had certain communications about things that were going to take place. I mean, that was the way you were informed about what government was doing. Right now, there's social media, there's misinformation, disinformation, there's people finding their own groups, their own information. So it's very hard to bring across messages that are, let's say, are unifying. And I do think that that's a challenge for everybody, whether it has to do with sustainability, whether it's political messages. Everybody is the own editor of their own, let's say, private newspaper. My timeline on my social media looks different from yours and looks different from yours. And everybody gets a different set of news, gets a different set of influences. And so it's very difficult to convince people. I think it's a challenge in general. If everybody is, let's say, God in their own timeline and makes their own news, so to speak, and gets caught in rabbit holes on certain topics, then it's very hard to have a unifying message. And I think it's in general a challenge for politics, for society, for companies to come back with a unifying message. A society of 11 million individuals is very, very, very easy to divide. So we do need a positive story on that, on the fact that having a society and having a strong links within society is something that makes us stronger as a person, but as a society as well. A society of 11 million individuals can be easily divided, and in times of crisis, you need to be united. We saw it at the start of COVID. For a couple of weeks, you saw that. We applauded for people who worked in care. You had volunteers working in the vaccination centers, etc. But then it disappeared quite easily as well. And I think that is a huge challenge, not just for the windmills, for any societal issue. It means that tackling big societal challenges was easier 50 years ago than it is today. Precisely because we value our individual liberty, because we value our own individual voice, because we think our own personal interest should be of state importance, you cannot have that. You cannot have 11 million people who think that their issue is the most important on the planet. And how do you bring that back? I don't have the solution right now. There's a lot of things going on in politics. There's in Belgium, in other countries as well. And we are in a society in which the best informed or the most thought out argument isn't necessarily the one that works. Mm-hmm. It is the emotions that you convey in people that count. That mean whether you can mobilize them, yes or not. You then move from, let's say, a written culture in which arguments, counter-arguments, synthesis count. You move from written culture to an oral culture in which cliché works, in which exaggeration works, in which lies work. But you will need to learn the lingo of this new communication landscape. Because if you keep communicating like in the old days, like I write a piece in a newspaper, and then everybody will be convinced, well, chances are 99% of the people won't even have read your piece. And the comment on your piece, which lasts 5 seconds on TikTok, will have been seen by 500,000 people. That is the communication space you're playing in. And that means that is a challenge, as I said, for the windmill, for big social changes, for increasing the pension age. And that's something as a society we have to find answers to. And right now, let's say the bad guys or the guys who want to make a benefit of that are on the upper hand. And we need to formulate an answer to that, because otherwise we will be divided as a society and we will not be able to get anything through.
Yeah, I agree with this analysis. And for me, one of the solutions seems to save democracy is maybe change also our democracy. And the idea of G1000 in Belgium promoting deliberative democracy, I really like the idea. It's by putting real citizens together, 100 people discussing about those big societal issues. What you see is that mostly if they get access to all experts, they can ask everyone, but they have to come up with proposals to solutions with compromises, what you see is that 80% of them agree and they understand each other, and 10% is saying it's much too far going far, and 10% is saying no, it's not enough at all. And today, what we see in media, in social media especially, you see both the extremes, and then it's 50-50, it's polarization. But I really think that if people just meet again and talk, really, 80% of people are very reasonable.
Within such an environment, Brecht, how difficult is it for you, for instance, to sit down with boards of directors within companies to convince them that ESG is not a marketing hype that they can use in their own communication, but that they can see it as a competitive enabler?
Yeah. Necessity is the mother of all innovation, right? And people put their attention where their money is. Those are two things, if you combine them, where you can make the case. So that's why I'm such a fan, I would say, of market instruments, because in the end, the CFO looks at the money in companies. And if there, of course, is a sustainability and decarbonization element where you can do good for the planet, if you can reconcile the two in a smart way, I think you have a case. So instead of a lot of companies that are until now looked at this decarbonization ESG problem just from a check in the box compliance point of view, now looking at it from, okay, what will happen in the next 15 years, that is vital. I always start from the situation of, okay, currently we have that European carbon market, but all these carbon markets who are set to be created in the future, and the announcements are done. India is looking at one, China is looking to expand. So Turkey just created one. So it is expanding. Kazakhstan is currently creating one. So a lot of these, Australia, Canada is also looking at it to get a fixed price on carbon. So it's something which is evolving across the globe. Then a company needs to say, okay, I am a global company. I have many plans across the globe. If I make a decision, an investment decision, I cannot make this in isolation anymore. I need to factor all these prices in. So, for example, a carbon capture storage facility, usually it's a capex investment of more than $1 billion, sometimes up to $3 billion. Huge. What is for me the best place currently to do that investment? At what time? Because some commodities are impacted, other not. Every carbon market has a different price, a different commodities that are impacted, a different pace. And me as a company, I need to create my strategy for the next 5-10 years. It's super hard. So that's why we say, okay, let's do that analysis of how you will be impacted. That's a financial incentive. And at the same time, you're doing something good for the planet. If you can reconcile those two, you have a business case. Because what I think that happened in the past years is that we looked at it from an ideological point of view. We should decarbonize, full stop. Yeah, okay, but then how will we do that? Can we do that in a smart way? Can we showcase to businesses that there is a competitive advantage if they would do this right now compared to their peers? That are all elements to make the case and to convince those companies in getting to decarbonize, starting to decarbonize, but you need to showcase them how they will be impacted. So that's always how I think usually it works. Creating awareness, education, because you would be surprised by the amount of companies that are still not aware what the impact of a CBAM will be on their profitability. It's astonishing sometimes. So again, education, showcasing how this will be impacted and using that market signal are the instruments to raise the awareness and usually starts a track of decarbonization in a smart way, competitive sustainability in the end.
A general question for the three of you. Are there any innovations you see as game changers in the near future for a green transition?
Shall I start? I think artificial intelligence is super important. And I hope artificial intelligence can also be the solution for its own problem. Because in the end, AI, massive amount of data centers, massive amount of electricity that you need for that. How is that electricity being generated? So having smart algorithms that can define the consumption, that can define the smartest way of tapping into a specific energy source, I think that's the future. Also having efficient AI models, knowing, and that's again about the literacy. If I send an email, if I do something virtually, it has a footprint, because we all think that whatever we do on our phones, on our laptops, it has an impact. Something in the back is a machine, a data center is generating the power to do the things that I would like to do. Again, awareness, because we are usually not aware how these things come into fruition. It is somewhere in the back that magically all these things are happening and are being generated. But there, I think artificial intelligence is an important component, because decarbonization in the end, electrification, it's a very complex problem. A lot of data points are being affected, are being included, and how to find in that maze of changing environments, changing consumer preferences, changing carbon markets, all these things are so difficult and always moving. How I, as a CFO, as a CEO, from a corporate strategy point of view, need to find my way into that. I think having and analyzing the data, knowing what is for me the best possible pathway, is essential. You cannot manage what you cannot measure. That is for me a vital component where AI could play a role and will be a differentiator in the next 10 to 15 years to decarbonize and to steer a company towards sustainability.
Any others you think of?
Well, I think, personally, it's not a new technology, but I say the revival of nuclear technology and nuclear energy, I think that is the way forward. There's one thing I don't agree with Piet, is that I think we want the same thing, is that the richer a society is, the more energy it consumes. If you look at historically, what I always do is, if you look at a movie, for example, a movie from the Middle Ages or the cowboys, westerns, or Industrial Revolution, I always try to look for the sources of energy in those movies. In the Middle Ages, it was water, it was wind, and fire, maybe, in which you made swords and steel, and you actually needed heat to produce certain stuff. So society needs energy. And the more energy you can use and you can harness, the more well-developed you are. There's an interesting graph which shows the average electricity consumption per person and the average GDP per capita of all the countries in the world. Well, there is no rich country which is low in energy. The richer you become, the more energy you will use, be it because of the use of cement or because of the use of electric cars, making a car, the data centers, GDP per capita, so prosperity and your energy consumption is completely linked. Now, where I do agree with Piet is that over the past 200 years, having more energy meant emitting more CO2. Now, that is the link we need to cut. So if we want to become richer, if we as a country want to become richer, if we want Afghanistan to become richer, we need more energy, much more energy, zillions of energy, but it has to happen without CO2. That is what we need to do. So we need more energy, but let's try to do it without using CO2. And I think then that nuclear energy will see a revival. I think it's still a catastrophic mistake that Germany actually closed down its nuclear plants for ill-informed reasons, and because of that became extremely dependent on a dictatorship in Russia, and that is why it's in the trouble where it is right now. People say nuclear energy is too expensive, etc. Well, you see a number of companies in the US, like Amazon, like Microsoft, precisely because of their AI energy needs, are actually opening up nuclear power plants themselves. And so you don't need to build these huge ones that we had in Belgium. You have these small modular reactors. Even Bill Gates, who's written an interesting book about tackling the big challenges of our day, is quite a big fan of those. So I think if the interest is there, that there's going to be private capital enthusiasm to actually come up with these with that energy form. And of course, we will need to combine it with wind and solar, etc. It is important for Europe. We don't have any fossil fuels ourselves. If we want to stay independent of other regions, we will need to go for fossil fuel-free, carbon-free, which means we need the wind and the solar in the places where there's enough wind and enough sun. but we need, for the baseload, we need nuclear energy. And that revival, you're seeing it already. Even the new German government, or the new to-be chancellor, has said that they're going to reconsider this. Even Japan is opening them again. France is investing. So that is what we need. And if we do that, if we have enough energy, we will have enough prosperity. I'm sure of that.
I will not go into the details of nuclear or not, but for me, it's clear that that's true. There is a relationship between prosperity and energy consumption, and we need more energy, but we need more green energy, in my opinion. And so there is no one solution. I also, if you ask the question, what will be the innovation? It's clear that AI in almost every proposal I see last years, it's always about AI. AI also using to lower energy consumption. It's about the big industries like the vessels, the ships bringing the containers. They are really capex intensive market where those vessels just go full speed from one continent to another. Yeah, just by making smarter, putting some sensors on those ships can make it reduce the consumption with 4 or 5%. Seems not much, but 5% on 1,000 of liters of dirty gas oil every hour. It's a lot of carbon emissions reduction. And so also with buildings, and there is a comparison with office buildings and ships. Both are long-term investments where it's a kind of immobile. The real estate market is not really innovative during years. They made money during years, but they're also using AI to make air conditioning systems smarter. It exists. It's 20% reduction just without capex. It's only software. It's a SaaS model, and so those kind of solutions using AI to reduce energy consumption is one of the things that I see happening.
We're almost at the end of the debate. As a wrap-up, I'd like each one of you to share a key takeaway for Europe's decarbonization journey. Piet, I will start with you.
I think for me, this energy transition, or call it decarbonization, it should be also socially accepted. So for me, giving more attention to the equality, and it's also a social issue. And so if I always give the example of these marches organized by Greta Thunberg, but also in Belgium, 100,000 young people, but it was all from the general school education system, not from the technical. We missed 65% of the young people were not there. So we have to include everyone if we want to make this transition happening. So for me, on polarization, democracy, on equal opportunities, these are the clues to make this green transition.
Peter?
Well, I think that do it in a sensible way. If we force it too fast, we will actually lose voters to extreme parties because of rising energy prices, and you already see that people are feeling left behind. If you look at electoral votes in Europe, and we will lose the industry as well. And that's you cannot build a prosperity on an economic cemetery, and that is very important. And so I do think if we want to have a pricing mechanism, if we want to have, let's say, the scale with which you can do things efficiently and effectively, we need European scale on companies to come up with solutions. It's not a solution to have subscale companies in each country try to come up with the solutions which are duplicated 200 kilometers further away, which means we will have to have less borders within Europe, less red tape in Europe, more investor-friendly environment in Europe, and allow cross-border takeovers. We need European champions, energy-wise, energy transmission-wise, nuclear power plants, etc. We need to tackle this on a European scale. So we have the choice. either we stay on our own islands and we go down separately, or we try to thrive in a united fashion. I think that is ultimately what needs to happen. The fact that it didn't happen up to today means that there's a lot of resistance. There's a lot of resistance because otherwise we would have done it 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So let's hope that the current crisis we're facing, the world is in turmoil, that this is enough of a catalyst to do what's needed. What is often said, Milton Friedman once said that in normal times we face the tyranny of the status quo. And it's only in times of crisis that which is politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. And what determines which things go from the politically impossible category to the politically inevitable? That is the ideas going around at that point in time. So if everybody says we're going to try to solve it ourselves, then that will be what ultimately becomes the solution. If we actually go for less regulation, more European market, single market, cross-border takeovers, bigger companies, the right incentives and an acceptable scale of decarbonization, then this could be the catalyst that Europe needs to actually start thriving again.
Brecht.
I think both gentlemen summarized it really well. Another quote of Friedman is, you can lead the horse to the water, but you can't make him drink. So you need to somehow make it clear why we are doing this. Why is it this beneficial for society? I see really a shift in consumer preference as well. If you see my parents and the parents of my parents, the awareness of sustainability, of climate change was really almost non-existent. And if you see now, as Piet is saying, how younger people, the Generation Y, Generation Z, are looking at this problem, they are aware because they will be impacted, their children will be impacted. I see really a change in consumer preference. And in the end, companies, they try to focus on consumers. They are consumer-minded, consumer-driven, meaning that if society changes, company will change as well. And I think next to that, technology will play a vital role because we need to be smart. Economic growth before was, let's put more people to work and then we have more economic growth. Now it's also about more productivity. So being smart, having technology that can replace things that are done before by people, but doing that in a smart way and using that AI productivity gains in decarbonization, I think that will be the most important thing for Europe to do, to become again a leader in clean tech. As Draghi formulated it, it is economic security, decarbonization, and competitiveness. They all need to be looked at from the same angle and not kind of different things that have nothing to do with one each other. So that would be my takeaway.
And I want to thank you all for this very interesting debate. And let's keep the conversation going as we work towards a sustainable and competitive Europe. Thank you all.